All right, so let's move on to our tech corner.
Besides Roman Grosjean exploding a few years ago, it used to be just a common thing, almost like wrecks are in NASCAR or in IndyCar, where wrecks happen all the time. Why don't we really see cars exploding like what we used to hear about in F1 anymore?
Well, it really all comes down to like everything else in motorsports, it all comes down to a matter of putting a premium on safety. We've all seen wrecks on film from the 60s and the 70s and stuff where you would see a car wreck and it would just turn into an enormous ball of fire. I mean, we saw that happen at the Nürburgring in the fire that nearly took the life of Niki Lauda.
Yeah.
And the reason why it really has to do with the way that the fuel tanks evolved over the years. So kind of a brief history of the fuel tank design. And I'm in the early days of Formula One where the engine was in front, the fuel tank was usually in the rear behind the driver. But the thing was, though, is that the tanks were usually made out of aluminum in an effort to save weight, or they were made out of other materials. But like all metals, they're very prone to breakage. The cars would basically burst into flames because all they had to do was rupture. And then if they happened to fall on the hot exhaust coming off the engine or anything like that, it was immediately burst into flames. As the cars evolved and the cars went from front engine to mid engine, where the engine was situated behind the driver, now the designers had to figure out a place to put the fuel tanks. And so what they did is, especially in the 60s and early 70s, in the cigar car era, the drivers literally sat in between the fuel tanks. So they would literally have two fuel tanks on each side of the driver of the monocoque where the driver was sitting. But again, they were still made out of metal. They still were very prone to rupture. And that's why a lot of times when you would see the car split in half,
Yeah.
they literally would tear the fuel lines coming from the tanks into the engine, would literally rip in half. And then fuel would spill and the ensuing fireball. And it wasn't until like the late 70s, early 80s that more attention was being paid to the design and the placement of the fuel tanks.
So how do the current fuel tanks differ? So you were talking about how they were used to be made out of metal and very prone to leakages and fires and explosions. How does the current F1 fuel tanks differ from those in the past that were made of metal?
So for one thing, they are no longer made out of metal, as you alluded to. They are all Formula One fuel tanks now are made with a combination of Kevlar fabric and rubber. And it's a combination of both synthetic and natural rubbers. Because the FIA has mandated that the fuel tanks have a maximum size that they can be. Now, a lot of them actually start the race with less fuel because as the hybrid power units have become more and more efficient, they've been able to shrink the size of the fuel tank down. They still have a pre-described size, and the fuel tank is usually located right behind the driver, between the driver and the power unit, but it's usually fairly low down. Usually starts somewhere in line with the butt of the driver and rises up to just about the level of their neck.
What other technologies are used in the fuel tanks?
One of the things we talked about just a minute ago was when the fuel lines would be torn apart that would cause the fuel to spill. Well, now all of the fuel lines, they're mandated, they have to be by the FIA, they cannot exceed a specific diameter. So you can't have one team running a larger fuel line, which allows them to carry more fuel in the fuel line or to be able to feed it into the engine faster. And all of the fuel lines at several points along the way, both at the point where they connect to the fuel tank, to the fuel pump that's part of the fuel tank, all the way back to the power unit. There are several points in there where they have self-sealing valves, and those valves are actually designed to break away. So if in the event that there is an accident, those valves actually have that little breakaway in it and will actually seal itself off in the event of an accident so that prevents the fuel from spilling. All of the teams actually use a baffling system because as the cars roll through the corners and as they pitch forward and back under braking and under acceleration, the fuel will have a tendency to slosh around. So unlike your typical road car, which will only have one pickup point for the fuel, most modern Formula One cars will have anywhere between 2 to 4 actual small electrical fuel pumps that will be located in each corner of the fuel tank. And then they use a series of baffles inside of the tank that have one-way valves on it, so that as the car moves and as the fuel moves around inside of the tank, it can go into the areas where those fuel pumps are at that are used for picking up the fuel. But as the car switches to another direction, as the fuel burns down, it keeps it from being able to move around from one side of the car. So it takes and it keeps the maximum amount of fuel available at the pickup points. And then each of those fuel pumps will pull their fuel into what's referred to as the collector, which is a larger fuel pump that is usually situated at the top or fairly close to the fuel entry point on the bladder. And that larger fuel pump is what will actually collect the fuel from all of them in order to make sure that the fuel stays at a consistent pressure, and then feeds that into the power unit.
You and I have talked about this many, many times about how Grosjean's fire happened, what happened with the accident, how he was able to survive. In fact, we've talked about this a couple times on the podcast. So can you talk to us a little bit about how did that fire actually happen? What was the survivability like? How has technology progressed even since back then? Can you talk to us a little bit about those?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, we talked about how the fuel lines are actually designed to have weak spots where, if they're in the case of an accident, the fuel line will break at those spots, and those spots have self-sealing valves and everything. Well, what happened was because of the force in which Grosjean went into that metal barrier, is that it was actually able to rupture one of the fuel lines, because it happened so quickly that before the self-sealing valve had a chance to break away, a piece of metal was actually able to puncture the existing fuel line in one of the stronger points, but where it didn't have one of those self-sealing valves. And so when it did, that rupture is what caused the fuel to spill on the hot engine, which then caused the fire to happen. And that's per the FIA's official findings. They've done some additional reinforcing of the fuel lines. And then as far as the survivability goes, Romain Grosjean was actually in that fire for 27 seconds. And which 27 seconds may not seem like a lot, but when you're on fire, you're sitting in a fire, that feels like a eternity. All drivers are mandated by the FIA and by Formula One that they have to be able to prove that they can extract themselves from the car under their own power, if they're able to be able to take and undo the buckles and remove their harnesses and extract themselves from the car within a certain number of seconds. Now, I know it used to be they had to do it within 10 seconds. That was pre-Halo. Now, I know that they've increased the amount of time because of the Halo, but I know it's only by a couple of seconds. And I don't have the exact number in front of me at the moment. But that's basically part of what helped save Grosjean, is the fact that he already had to be able to pass a test from the FIA to prove that he could get out of the car. So he was able to regain his senses, get himself out of there. And then plus, we've also talked about the fire safety suits.
It's always amazing to me how far we've come in technology, that somebody
absolutely
just 5 years ago probably would have died from that same crash, and he walked away.
Yes, absolutely. Because of the FIA's findings and everything, they've actually implemented additional safeties into it that I really think that George Russell's accident from earlier this year, because of the way he went into the barrier, it very well could have been a very similar situation. But again, because of those safety measures that are in place, the fuel system itself is actually able to seal itself off to keep any kind of fires from happening. And that's your tech corner for this week. So let's move on to what is, most of you know, is my favorite part of the week. We're on to Stump the Pundit. So Corey, what brain teasers do you have for me this week?
I'm sure we're going to talk about this in the news as well, but something recently has happened to Binotto. I won't go into what yet, but I thought, hey, since he's possibly coming back to F1, why don't we do a Stump the Pundit on how well Scott knows Binotto?
Okay. Not very well, but let's go.
It's funny because he had a little bit more than James Viles did. He's a ghost for the most part on the internet. I mean, obviously his what he's doing now and everything like that, but largely there's not a whole lot of background on the guy. So struggled a little bit, but here we go. So in what year did Binotto join Ferrari?
Oh, I even read this somewhere. I want to say this is just purely a guess, but I'm gonna say it was 2006, 2007, somewhere in that time frame.
No, this one surprised me quite a bit because I thought it was like you. It was actually 1995.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, he was
So
just
yeah, so he had quite a tenure with Ferrari. That's
yeah,
surprising.
yeah.
I'm shocked at that one.
What other roles did he have at Ferrari? Because obviously he wasn't team principal when he first started. So what other roles did he have?
At one point, he was a race engineer, then was later promoted to technical director. And then from technical director, he was promoted to team boss, but I don't know what other jobs he may have held while he was at Ferrari.
Yeah. So those are all right. So he started in the engine department, and he actually started with some of the KERS updates. He became head of the engine department in 2013 and then CTO in 2016.
Wow. Okay.
What year did he become the team principal?
He became team principal in 2019.
Awesome. Right on. Who did he replace as that team principal?
Oh, ooh, that's a good question because there was at least one or two team principals in between Todt and Binotto. But honestly, right now it's escaping me who those individuals were.
He replaced Maurizio Aravini in 2019 as team.
Okay.
Last question, and this is a personal one on Binotto's side, but what is his winery's name?
Oh, I used to know this. I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember what is. I used to know what it was, but I don't remember.
Binotto Manzato is what it's called.
Oh, okay.
And that's
Interesting.
what we have for Stump the Pundit.
Awesome.
So now you know Binotto a little bit better than you did a few minutes ago.
Yeah, absolutely.